It's a huge mistake that I think a lot of college students make. They kind of don't realize how competitive it is. They have a good GPA. They have, they go to a good school, and they think if I just come in here and I'll do a few mock interviews and I'll go in and I'll just put on a smile and firm handshake. It's just not enough nowadays. You really have to wow them.
You are now tuned into the Misi Muse Unplugged, a pop-up podcast variety show helping consultants along their journey to greatness with your host, management consultant, author and blogger, Christy Lindor.
Hey, my go-getters. Welcome to the Misi Muse Unplugged podcast show. I'm your host, Christy Lindor, excited to be bringing you episode 36. And today we're going to be doing a quick wins interview. If this is your first time tuning in, quick wins are when we have a chance to connect with individuals discussing ideas, products, or services to really help round out your consulting toolkit. Today's guest, we've actually got Patrick Curtis. A little bit about Patrick. He's a former investment banker. He's now the CEO and founder of WallStreetOasiscom. And in today's interview, go-getters, he really shares, really some good insights on his career journey. He shares a little bit about the founding story of WallStreetOasiscom, which actually has an emerging consultant community on there. And he really gives us some insights. He's in the beginning of starting to collect a lot of data, user-driven data collection on the consulting industry that I think you will find extremely helpful. Over time, you'll be able to really get some really cool insights and trends on the consulting industry. And if you are data-driven, you love the numbers, go-getters, you can actually go to WallStreetOasis.com now and sign up, become a member, and start to actually get some of the emerging data sets and insights that's being provided. So things like, what schools are being heavily recruited at certain consulting firms or consulting firm salaries. I know those that are in consulting, they can never get enough of talking about salary and trends and that sort of thing. So you can actually start to get that type of information at WallStreetOasis.com. So Patrick shares his vision of the service that he's providing and a little bit about how you can get connected. It's going to be a really cool conversation. Stick around for that. Also wanted to share, go-getters, my book has been officially distributed. Excited on Tuesday, February 20th. The Misi Muse has officially released. So make sure you check it out, get yourself a copy. We're shipping worldwide now, and we'll keep you posted. I know we've got a lot of things in the works in terms of how you are able to get a copy of the paperback book, and we'll keep you posted on those efforts. But with that, let's get started. So Patrick, welcome to the Misi Muse Unplugged. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm super psyched to get a chance to connect with you. Big fan of your site, WallStreetOasis.com. So I know this is going to be a great conversation. So Patrick, I guess before we get started with today's discussion, maybe if you can take a moment to introduce yourself to the go-getters of the Misi Muse Unplugged.
Sure. So as Christy said, I'm Patrick Curtis. I was born in the Boston area. Grew up around there, went to college at Williams, middle of nowhere. I ended up working in investment banking for a few years after that, to private equity, and then eventually founded Wall Street Oasis around 2006 and have been working in the online space, trying to make it the best community possible for the past almost 12 years now, which is shocking. But yeah, and as part of that, our consulting community has really taken off over the last, 5 to 7 years within Wall Street Oasis. So I'd love to answer any questions you'd have on that.
Yeah. So 2 fun facts you just mentioned. At first, I didn't realize that, WallStreetOasis.com was almost 12 years old. That's pretty remarkable. And 2, I didn't know you were from Boston. I had no idea. What part of Boston are you from?
So I was born in Brookline, and I grew up in a town called Andover, north of the city.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Yes. Brookline and Andover, good spaces. Hopefully you have not been around here lately. It's like
I have not. Negative. I live in California now, so I've avoided the... I've been lucky.
Oh, we've got pummeled, Patrick.
Yeah, my family's telling me. They're saying we were coming to California. That's what they're all saying. So.
Oh, yeah. They're all running over there. Well, thank you for sharing that intro. I guess before we start to delve in a little bit, I'd love to hear the founding story about WallStreetOasiscom. But before we do that, maybe, you can take a step back and share with us kind of how you decided to, go into investment banking. And then, how did you end up making the leap, kind of starting the website and anything you can share just to give people a little bit more kind of color context. That'd be great.
For sure. So, when I was at Williams, I was an economics major and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I think, coming from a liberal arts school like Williams, I think a lot of people, you get to sophomore, junior year and all of a sudden people are asking you, what do you want to do? And I think a lot of us, or a lot of students kind of face this dilemma of, do you want to continue to be dependent on mom and dad, or do you want to be independent? For me, I knew I was really just didn't want to have to be dependent on them anymore. And so I started doing research in terms of what types of companies were recruiting at Williams, and actually the connection to Wall Street and to investment banks, that even that liberal arts college was actually very strong, and actually consulting companies as well. So I ended up interviewing for a bunch of consulting firms and a bunch of investment banks, and I struck out at a lot of them, and especially the consulting firms. But I can say that, I learned a lot in the process, and I ended up, lucky enough in 2002, right after, 9/11 and a huge market crash, I was able to land an investment banking job at Rothschild in New York. But it was definitely a long slog and very tough to actually land that interview. So in terms of why and what, it wasn't, looking back and realizing how little I actually knew in my sophomore and junior year when I started kind of deciding this is what I wanted to do. It's a little bit comical in terms of saying, "Oh, I knew I wanted to be an investment banker." It's more of a. I think a lot of people fall into that path, and I think that was, if I'm being honest, that was probably the reason why. I was just, hey, I don't want to be dependent on my family anymore. To they're paying the bills for my school and whatnot. I wanted to be independent, move to a big city, and have a job that would allow me to do that.
What's fascinating about what you just shared, Patrick, is that, you mentioned about trying out in different consulting firms. I actually know a lot of consultants that have been eyeing the world of investment banking for quite some time, and they're trying to decide if that's where they want to maybe make a leap to get, a little bit more experience that parallels the consulting industry. What would you say are some of the things that you enjoyed the most, when you were working in that space? And then what were some things that you're like, I could do without?
So I think, at the junior levels for investment banking, it's notorious for the long hours. And I think they're for good reason. I mean, it's true. I think the banks are trying to make a better effort to actually make the lifestyle a little bit more bearable, since they're having a tough time retaining some of their top talent. They're having a lot more competition. And I'm sure consulting firms are having some of this with tech and with startups and with a lot of the top talent not deciding, I'm going to do my own thing, or I'm not going to go into, the traditional industries that they'd been into in the past. So especially at MBAs, you're seeing this as well. So, I mean, in terms of what I didn't like, it's what you'd expect. It's the long hours. It's some of the monotony of the job, working till 3 or 4 a.m. and having to worry about footnotes and, oh, this word is not italicized or this word's not underlined. That being said, it still taught me an incredible amount in a very short period of time, especially given where I came from, a liberal arts background, no finance, no accounting background, and being able to kind of ramp up. And within 2 years, being able to be kind of a wizard in Excel and be able to understand the complex balance sheets of companies and all that. So I think there's definitely cons to the job and to the industry. It's extremely demanding, especially in the junior ranks. But there's also a lot of benefits, especially the exit opportunities.
Right. And then, you mentioned, Patrick, about, not really being able to strike out with the consulting firms. Maybe share like a story, for the go-getters out there that may be in the throes of, consulting interview, or they're going through the recruit. Actually, right now, the beginning of the year is prime recruitment time for target schools. Maybe share what were some of the lessons learned that you had from that experience.
I think, people who are more comfortable, like myself, sitting in a room and having a one-on-one conversation sometimes make the mistake of thinking that they can build a connection with the interviewer without doing enough of their technical background knowledge. And I think that may have been more the case back when I was in school back in, the early 2000s. I think nowadays, most candidates, there's enough knowledge and online being shared, whether that's various interview courses or whatnot, that people understand that the competition is much more fierce. But for myself back in 2001 or 2, I felt like, oh, I can go in there, I can logic through, I can reason myself through these case interviews, and I had heard of them, and done a few practice ones, but I hadn't really drilled down into the frameworks. I hadn't really drilled down and done a lot of mock interviews. And, you shouldn't be using your actual interviews as practice. It's a huge mistake that I think a lot of college students make. They kind of don't realize how competitive it is. They have a good GPA. They have, they go to a good school, and they think if I just come in here and I'll do a few mock interviews and I'll go in and I'll just put on a smile and firm handshake. It's just not enough nowadays. You really have to wow them. And I think in order to do that, there needs to be a lot of practice prior to the interview.
Yeah.
I mean, it's unbelievable the amount I personally improved from my first interview to my 30th interview. It was just a completely different person.
Yeah.
So imagine if you front end that and you're actually able to do all those practice mock interviews with your friends or family or a mentor, for example.
What you just said is so spot on. I've actually been experiencing that here where, right now we're to the point where, at least in my experience, we've been splitting hairs. Candidates are coming in and they're on point.
Right.
And they are really, and because they understand the competition, as you say, and they've got the resources out there. So it's really gotten, I think, even more so competitive than it has in the past, because there's fewer slots, a lot more really, really well-rounded candidates for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And I think so for the people who are not, they're a little bit more shy, or they're a little bit not as comfortable one-on-one, really working on that eye contact, working on that body language is important for them. But, maybe they'll be great at the technical aspect of the case and they'll be able to kind of do all the case math really quickly and easily. For the people who are a little bit more confident, don't underestimate the other side of the equation. So I think it depends on the type of candidate and where their weaknesses are. I think it's important to have that self kind of realization of where you can improve and how you can make yourself a better interviewer. Because like anything, I think it's a skill that can be taught and learned and improved upon.
Awesome.
Now available on Amazon. Management consultant and author Christy Lindor shares career secrets based on 15 years of experience working at top firms in a new book called The MECE Muse. 100 plus selected practices, unwritten rules, and habits of great consultants. The MECE Muse provides insights, stories, and strategies on the unwritten rules of the consulting profession. Christy conducted research and connected with 50 plus industry titans across 27 professional service organizations on what makes a great consultant. For book reviews, tour dates, and more info, go to www.mecemuse.us.
I'm going to pivot slightly, Patrick. I want to talk about WallStreetOasiscom. I love a good founding story. So share the story of kind of like, how'd you wake up and decide to do this? And, a little bit about kind of the beginning of the journey.
Sure. I think it was late 2005 or early 2006. I think I came across an article, 30 under 30, one of these lists of Forbes. And I started at my private equity fund then, and I was working, a manageable 60 hours a week instead of 80 to 100 hours a week. So I felt like I had all this free time all of a sudden. But so I was reading these businesses, and what struck me was that, some were excellent businesses, but none of them were necessarily revolutionary. Some were great ideas, some were, they're all good ideas, but none of them struck me as impossible to do. And so I thought to myself, what could I do to kind of start building my own thing where, I'm not dependent on an employer to, for everything. And so I think, and part of the reason I was looking for that was because my experience, I had been fired 6 months after starting my first job in private equity. So it was, I walk into a room expecting my first bonus and I'm let go. And that was right after I had moved from New York after investment banking to private equity at a firm in Boston. And so that experience really shook my confidence, really kind of made me step back and feel like less secure, if that makes sense. A little bit more of, what could I do? What could I build to protect myself in a way and over long term have something that I can fall back on either as a side income or as a full-time business. So rewind to 2006, I'm looking at the business and it kind of strikes me as, it would be really great to start something myself. And wait a second, none of these are revolutionary. Why don't I just start something about something I know? And so I was talking with my friend who was at the time getting his PhD at MIT. So he knew all the tech computer stuff, which I still know very little to this day about. And he helped me create an online community for initially for just investment bankers. And it was called iBankingOasis.com. So it was rebranded several years later, but he's the one who initially got me set up and started, and I started kind of growing it and marketing it and getting it out to like the investment banking clubs at all the universities. And there was enough, this was early enough and there was enough activity in '06 that it got me very excited because I could see there was a need for it. I could see that people wanted a place to go online to discuss, interviews, to discuss strategies on how to network, to discuss, how to break in. And then we saw just naturally the site evolve into kind of a career advice space where people would come to have fun conversations, but they'd also come to try and get advice for their specific situation. And it naturally extended to consulting, to private equity, to hedge funds and the like.
Awesome. You mentioned the consultant. That was actually my next question, Patrick, was I do notice that there is a budding, emerging consulting community on the site. Maybe share how you kind of decided to leap. I know there was a parallel to the iBanking space, but maybe share a little bit more about kind of the consulting kind of side of the community.
Sure. So I think, it was a natural extension of, the investment banking side, just because even though it's a very different industry, I felt like the same candidates that are targeting investment banking are often targeting management consulting because they're some of the most sought after jobs, the jobs that set you up best for long-term career success. And so in terms of, the jobs that I knew, the jobs that I had interviewed for, and the jobs that I felt were, of the standard and caliber that the community was kind of interested in, it was a natural fit. So, people would be talking about investment banking XYZ, and they'd say, "Oh, I also have an interview at MBB or whatnot," and what are they going to ask me here? So those conversations were already happening on the site organically, and so it was just a question of setting up a dedicated space for that area.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to shift gears quickly and talk a little bit about the consulting report. I've noticed that you've got, maybe share kind of how you decided to create the report and maybe just some insights on, what people can expect from the report, and is it annual, anything like that would be great.
Sure. So for a little bit of background, about 4 years ago, or actually 6 years ago, in late 2012, we announced something called the company database on Wall Street Oasis, where we were going to start collecting interview insights, compensation data, and company reviews across, thousands of companies, including management consulting firms, banks, hedge funds, private equity funds, asset managers, all those. And so we started kind of crowdsourcing all of this data from the community, and it got to the point where last year I said, we've had over 50,000 submissions into this company database, and we haven't done much with it because we've been so tied up with other aspects of the business. And I thought, I think it's really time we start taking this data and showing it to the community and making it valuable, because there's so much valuable information there. And so for the last second half of 2017, we worked really hard to actually start releasing what we call industry reports. So there's, the consulting industry report, the investment banking industry report, private equity, and hedge fund. Those are the four we started with. And the consulting, so when you say, is it annual? It's really, yes, it is annual. So what we do is every time it rolls over to a new year, so 2018 just started, a new set of reports will be created, but they're really a living, breathing thing. So as people enter in, so if somebody entered in something for a compensation data point, for example, in 2017, that would update 2017 still. So it's not as if it's closed and locked forever.
Got it.
As we collect more data, the reports do change and the rankings do change and all that. So, and the really, I think, interesting part about this isn't just the company rankings and the compensation data, but it's the other kind of more nuanced data we have, like intern offer rate percentages and the university statistics. So if like even high school or juniors in high school or seniors in high school are deciding between 2 or 3 colleges and they want to know, hey, well, what's going to set me up potentially, if I want to go into consulting, they can look and see, what schools have kind of a presence at what firms. And they can also even look at diversity statistics. If I'm a female and I, want to work at XYZ, are they well represented? So we have all this data that we've collected over the years that we're finally starting to kind of bring to the forefront of the site. And so we created an entirely new kind of main section of the site called reports that and along with that, the great part about it is people now see this. And so that they're now contributing even more. So the data is getting better and better because you can gain access to it just by contributing your own data. So that's we kind of see this being something where with investment banking, we have enough data where we can actually show trends now year over year. We can show like where one company's moved up or down relative to the others. We can show compensation trends by position. And I think our goal with consulting is by this time next year, we'll actually have the same type of thing for consulting firms.
So Patrick, with this report, maybe for the current version, because I know you mentioned it sounds like it's almost like a living document. What would you say is like one of the most surprising insights that you've kind of gleaned from all the data that you've been collecting?
Well, I was a little shocked that some of the work-life balance stuff in terms of the hours was much higher than I thought they would be. Not as high as banking, but they were up there in some of these firms. And it surprised me a little bit that it wasn't as tied to the typical firms you'd think of, like the Big Four or MBB. It wasn't always those firms at the top of some of those lifestyle things. It kind of like had some firms that I hadn't heard of, if that makes sense. Like smaller consulting firms seem to, there are some outliers there where they're working their consultants some extreme hours. So that was a little bit surprising to me. I would think that the smaller firms would have less leverage to be able to do that to their employees, but I guess that's not the case. In terms of what else, for consulting specifically, there wasn't any huge surprises. I would say that, the ones in terms of you think of as best leadership, competence, overall professional development, and overall employee rankings, the one you'd expect tend to be near the top. However, I would say that certain ones outside of MBB did creep into the top one or two in certain categories. So it's more interesting to see kind of the nuanced differences versus just, the overall ranking, which I think doesn't tell you as much.
Right. That sounds cool. So, and go-getters, we'll make sure we'll put some direct links to the reports and, to Wall Street Oasis, specifically the consulting community links. We'll put that on the show notes. So Patrick, one more thing around the report. If, you mentioned earlier that it's individuals, as they contribute, they can gain access to it. Maybe share a little bit about like the different people. Is it all types of folks in consulting? Is it, outsiders, former consultants? Maybe share like what's kind of the perfect persona that you seek to kind of contribute to this.
So I think anyone that's worked at a consulting firm or had an interview at a consulting firm. So even if you did not get a job at a consulting firm, you can still contribute by adding your interview insight there, talking about what was asked, where you were interviewed, what school you went to, because that gives us data on where they're searching and who they're interviewing, and we still use that to help compile a certain portion of the reports. So even if you've just had an interview, even if it's just a phone interview, you can contribute. Now, it's obviously people who've worked at the firms can give us more data on compensation and actual company reviews, and so you could add even more. But even just to get 1 month free access, you can just basically add in an interview insight, and boom, the whole report will unlock for you. So that's kind of how we're growing it, right? People are trying to see where are the rest of these rankings, or how can I look at the details by level and whatnot. And so that's helping us drive the submissions and giving us better data.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting, over the years as you start to get trends analysis and that sort. I'd love to have you back on the show, as this ramps up, because I'm sure it's going to just snowball.
Yeah, and it has. The rate of submissions has, I'd say, it's gone up like 5 to 6 times since we started releasing these reports, because I think people really want, now they see what's behind in the database. It's kind of visual now, and so it's much easier to understand what's there, and so everyone wants to be able to see it. So I think that's helping grow the database. It's just going to make it more valuable to everybody. So we're excited about that.
One more question. So I know a lot of the things we just talked about for the report were specific to some of the consulting shops out there. What about for freelance or solo, independent consultants? Would they be part of the community you're seeking, or are you really just seeking those that work at the consulting houses?
Yeah, that's a good question. We do allow, if you have data on a company that's not in the database, you can create the company. We do allow the community to, if we're missing a company. So if it's a small consultancy, 1-2 person shop, and if we don't have it, by all means, you can add it and still gain access. Obviously, that stuff, I don't know how many, if it's just a 1-person consultancy, it's a little bit tougher. I don't think it's as valuable piece of data as people who are, because they're probably interviewing nobody or 1 person a year or whatever, if they're looking to just stay as an independent freelance person. But yeah, it's still valuable. I think it's still a piece of data. It still, gives us data on the industry overall in terms of, compensation and stuff. So,
awesome. Awesome. Well, I know consultants love data, so I'm sure there's going to be, people listening to this episode is going to be running to the site, not only to contribute, but also to see the insights. I'm sure there's a lot of cool information out there. Well, Patrick, this has been a really great conversation. What advice would you give, a new or aspiring consultant, just given your experience, exposure to the world of consulting, your community? I'm sure you've learned a lot along the way. What type of advice would you give someone that's looking to come into this space?
I would just say make sure you do your research and your homework to understand what you're getting into and what each firm kind of offers and the culture at each firm. Don't just assume that, if I get into one of these firms, this is where I should go. Really try to get to meet and understand the people and what it's going to be like to work in a specific group. Because I know different firms have different kind of processes in terms of how they assign you and whatnot. So it's important to understand those nuances because it can really make a big difference in your quality of life and also what skills you develop, which is very important for potentially your next jump.
Couldn't agree more. If people wanted to get a hold of you, Patrick, how can they reach out to you?
Sure, they can reach me just through email, patrick@WallStreetOasis.com, or they can send me a tweet at WallStreetOasis.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This is such a great conversation. I look forward to continuing this discussion and hearing about the reports and just kind of being part of your community, Patrick.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, my go-getters, for tuning in. This is Christy Lindor signing out for the Macy Muse Unplugged Pop-Up Podcast. Here's to your journey to greatness.
Tune in every Friday for new episodes syndicated on iTunes, Google Play Music, and many more. Visit www.mecymuse.com for more information.